Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. I see students, friends, perhaps new acquaintances, colleagues. First, I just want to direct a few comments to my students. You may be wondering how tonight's lecture connects to this week's reading, which was Wang Huning's 美国反对美国, or America Against America. I first read this book on the recommendation of Mark Blythe, and as I just discovered, Mark is a friend of Jacob's, and I developed a great deal of jealousy over Jacob's friend circle, but I'll get over it. Anyway, Mark in a lecture described that book as the product of a Chinese political scientist visiting the United States in the 80s and thinking to himself, why are these people so foolish as to send all of their industry abroad? Well, sadly, that isn't actually a theme of the book, although it probably would have been had Wang visited the US in the 1990s and 2000s. But I was grateful for the recommendation nonetheless, because as often happens, having a foreign eye, it has fewer impediments in describing a domestic situation than someone who's actually from that environment. Just like, we humans can understand fish live in a world dominated by water, fish probably don't notice that at all. Wang's most profound insight, I thought, is in how capital controls society in the US. He writes, most of the institutions in the US are private, but in fact, they manage a very large part of affairs of the whole society. This management is not based on coercion and command, but rather voluntarily by each individual. Americans like to be governed least, but they like money most. The logic of money is to lead people to be governed. This mechanism is related to the basic survival of each person, making it a very effective form of management. Mobilizing the ability of money to govern people is a very important aspect of reducing the pressure on the political system to manage. The amazing dynamism of money connects individuals to individuals and institutions to institutions. The government transcends this set of mechanisms and controls them indirectly by legal means. The people in this mechanism, all operating in their own interest, maintain the balance. So this brings up a central theme of economic history, emulation. Countries seek to emulate what has proven successful for other countries. And here, it seems like Wang is foreshadowing how China would later emulate an aspect of US political economy, reducing burdens on government by outsourcing them to private institutions and individuals governed by the technology of money. In Professor Soll's book, as in Ha-Joon Chang's writing as well, emulation is a central constant of the history of economic development. England emulating Holland, France emulating both, the United States emulating all three, Germany emulating the US, Japan emulating Germany, Korea emulating Japan, and in the case of China, first emulating the USSR's successful industrialization strategy, then emulating the state-directed capitalism of England, France, the US, Germany, Japan, Korea, Singapore, etc. Right now, with the political establishment in the US planning an expansion of industrial policy and protectionism, and that's not just Trump, but Biden also, listen to Jake Sullivan's recent speeches, it seems like we've come full circle with the US emulating China's emulation of the US in the 19th and 20th centuries. So Professor Soll's book demonstrates how important an understanding of history is to contemporary economic debates. One of my favorite philosophers is the American George Santayana, and he's probably best known for the aphorism, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But in the case of contemporary free market ideology, it should be those who cannot remember the past are condemned not to repeat it. That is, not engage in emulating successful policies from history. A good part of this book is Professor Soll elaborating on how Adam Smith's version of free market thought was influenced by Cicero and the Stoic philosophers. Summarized as, if elite educated men focused on agriculture and exchanged goods righteously and ethically, then the market would work on its own and produce wealth, and the republic would prosper. But the book is also a treasure trove of insights from economic thinkers I had never been introduced to before, whose insights are still relevant today. Now, I'm going to use a lot of quotations from the book, but I'm not going to do precise quote, unquote. So I ask all of the students here not to emulate what I'm doing right now in your own writing, please. Okay, so just some examples. Jacob can correct my pronunciation. I might mangle a bunch of these names. Jean Bodin believed that having a fabulously wealthy oligarchic class was a threat that destabilized market mechanisms. Excessive wealth for the few and extreme poverty for the majority inevitably caused civil strife. Well, what does that sound like today? Hong Kong, mainland China, the United States, pretty much every country in the world on this planet. Edward Misselden, a quote directly from him: "Those that trade without order and government are like unto men that make holes in the bottom of that ship, wherein themselves be passengers." I love the old language. What does that sound like? That sounds like the current US political establishment recognizing that their free trade policy resulted in some industrial weakness domestically. Another line about Misselden: "Unskillful and disorderly persons would destroy trade and undermine trust with, among other things, mislabeled commodities." What does that sound like? 2008, great financial crisis, mislabeled or mischaracterized derivatives, your credit default swaps, your collateralized debt obligations. Moving on, Jean-Francois Mellon believed that the market would work through a balance between liberty and state regulation designed to support a national economic strategy. What does that sound like other than China during the reform and opening period? Ferdinando Galeani maintained that only the state had enough credit to handle food shortages in times of bad harvests, famines, and wars, requiring state warehousing and managing the grain supplies. Jacques Necker agreed that liberty was preferable to regulation, but that legislators had to make prohibitive laws so that the abuse of liberty in the grain market did not cause famines. Well, that is very reminiscent of Isabella Weber's work on ancient Chinese economic regulation in her book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy. I also want to bring up Necker a bit more because he sums up basically my personal view of the sort of ideal economic system. While market freedoms were key, they were best suited to non-essential products. And that sums up my view perfectly because, you know, I don't want octogenarian men in a Politburo somewhere designing next season's lingerie styles. But at the same time, I don't want Enron running, you know, energy provision for an economy. Robert Jacques Turgot believed that before freeing markets, one had to first protect the poor from the immediate market shock of liberalization, and that the state would have to step in to help those with no work and no food. That's precisely what did not happen in Russia in the 1990s, which is a major contributor to the state that Russia is in today. So in this book, I was introduced not only to thinkers from the early Christian church up into the 18th century, but a few thinkers I hadn't heard of before in the 19th and 20th centuries as well. For instance, William Cunningham, who declared that the tradition in which economics treats society as a mechanism gives valuable truth so far as it goes, but never the whole truth. Cunningham's point was that if economics wanted to be treated like a science, it would have to admit that much human economic activity does not work like a mechanism or a machine. Using Darwinian language, he said that society was instead an organism with powers of self-adaptation to its environment. Well, sadly, the still dominant paradigm of neoclassical economics does treat economies like a machine, but there are other paradigms like evolutionary economics and ecological economics, which think of economies in terms of complex systems, like an ecology, not a simple system such as a machine. There's also some really funny moments in the book, or at least I found them quite funny. For instance, during the 7 Years' War in France, it was made clear that agricultural society was giving way to a new commercial order. The reactionary French aristocratic ruling class did not want to sit passively by and watch as the merchants took over. Some even suggested that aristocrats should seize the means of production and wrest it away from the industrial classes. At that, I basically laughed out loud because I was just imagining all of the old like Soviet and Chinese propaganda posters in the style of socialist realism with the muscular workers with the fists raised, and the line is, you know, let's seize the means of production from the capitalist class. But instead of those muscular workers, I'm thinking of these like fancy French aristocrats with the powdered wigs and the makeup and the frilly costumes and whatnot. So I had to laugh at that part of the book. Jacob also engages in what you might call the political economy of economics in this book, investigating the political economic influences that shaped Adam Smith's thinking. He writes, Adam Smith's philosophy cannot be divorced from his personal life or from the material circumstances that helped make his first book a popular success. One aspect of those personal circumstances was a friendship with David Hume. I can't help but go off on a little tangent here. Hume I think, put soft power in the best terms I've seen. I'm going to quote from Hume here. Nothing appears more surprising to those who consider human affairs with a philosophical eye than the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. When we inquire by what means this wonder is effected, we shall find that as force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. It is therefore on opinion only that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as to the most free and most popular. Soft power is another theme of this book, and it appears in Jean-Baptiste Colbert's chapter, where he engages in a very successful propaganda campaign to convince Europe that France is the global leader of technology, science, industry, commerce, etc. It's also mentioned in the book, the 19th century US Senator Henry Clay, who understood economic theories as a form of soft power too, calling free trade theory of his day British colonialism. Well, you could fairly say that today's free trade theory is a form of US colonialism. Now, if you look up Professor Soll on the internet, you'll see him described as a historian of accounting. That's not the kind of research that typically provokes, vicious contestation and debate and ad hominem attacks and whatnot. But this book has. He's been inundated with hate mail because of this book. And it was recently reviewed in a libertarian magazine where the reviewer accused the book of egregiously sloppy scholarship. Now, in academia, them's fighting words. And also pretty rich in a review that doesn't engage in any attempt whatsoever to demonstrate with evidence that Soll's extensive discussion of Smith's thinking and influences is inaccurate. He basically just says, trust me, bro, he got it wrong. Why the backlash? Well, that was what I was most interested in as a political psychologist. I see this as cognitive dissonance reduction. Generations of people in the US and elsewhere have been raised with and indoctrinated in free market ideology. Within that ideology, Adam Smith is portrayed as a founding father, or maybe even a saint. If someone who believes in this ideology reads a book exhaustively demonstrating that Smith was not at all how he is made out to be within that ideology, that will provoke a painful feeling, cognitive dissonance. To reduce that feeling, one could revise their initial beliefs about Smith or rage against the historical scholarship forcing such a revision of their beliefs. And as John Kenneth Galbraith put it, faced with the choice between changing one's mind and proving there is no need to do so, almost everyone gets busy on the proof. Lastly, to explain the backlash, there's a matter of what I earlier called the political economy of economics. Here, I'll leave the last words to the great American essayist H.L. Mencken. He asks, are the reverend professors of economics free? With the highest respect, I presume to question it. Their colleagues of archaeology may reasonably be called free, and their colleagues of bacteriology and those of Latin grammar and sidereal astronomy, and those of many another science and mystery. But when one comes to the faculty of economics, one finds that freedom as plainly conditioned, though perhaps not as openly, as in the faculty of theology, and for a plain reason. Economics, so to speak, hits the employers of the professors where they live. It deals not with ideas that affect those employers only occasionally or only indirectly or only as ideas, but with ideas that have an imminent and continuous influence upon their personal welfare and security. and that affect profoundly the very foundations of their social and economic structure upon which their whole existence is based. It is, in brief, the science of the ways and means whereby they have come to such a state and maintain themselves in such a state that they are able to hire and boss professors. Now, the political economy and political psychology of economics is a topic that deserves another book, and maybe we'll collaborate on writing it, but that's for another day. Today, you're about to hear an account which fundamentally changed the way that I understand the history of economic thought, a historical account that nonetheless is of great relevance today for the US, China, and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jacob Soll.
That was great. That's the best review of my book I've ever heard. You have to publish. Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you for having me here. I love this city, by the way. It's fantastic. And so while I've spent a lot of time in Asia, I've never been to Hong Kong. And it's just blown me away completely. I love it. I'm actually sad right now because I'm leaving tomorrow. I'm happy to be with you, but I needed more time in this amazing, amazing city. And by, a city in which speaking about free market thought is, I think, pretty relevant. What I want to talk to you about today is a myth. And one of the things that's interesting, and that quote that Peter gave is so perfect, is that the job of historians is supposed to be to attack and undermine myths. Actually, theologians are really right, the ones who are supposed to uphold certain beliefs and belief systems. The idea of a historian is not to uphold a belief system, but rather to, try and dissect it and deconstruct it. When I started this book, I was stunned by when I read Adam Smith at how far away modern ideas of Smith's work and modern ideas of free market thought were from those who actually were from Smith's work, but also all these other people who were actually creating economic thought and building European modern capitalist economies. And they were somewhat successful. This allowed them to colonialize the world, right? So it seems to be a really important thing. I want to make the case today, a big case, that not only did Adam Smith not believe in greed, he completely misunderstood modern economics and therefore is not the father of capitalism. Now, here that might not sound like a big deal, but in the United States, it's such a big deal that I'm attacked almost every 48 hours on the web now. It's actually quite extraordinary. They're very personal attacks. So when people say, oh, what's the point of writing this book? Well, it turns out that this idea is heavily ingrained. Now, you might say to yourself, sure, free markets are great, low taxes, not too much government interference. But Adam Smith and free market economists have another theory. And their theory, this isn't working.
No.
We lost it.
We had it working.
We had it working. Hold on. Now that's not working either. Hold on. Maybe it's still there.
There we go.
Okay, wait. Okay. Here's this imposing thing of Smith. I want to just start by saying Adam Smith was not, nor has he ever been, a capitalist. He was a professor of the liberal arts, of moral philosophy, and he was a tax collector. He was also the servant of great lords. So he was not some businessman. He was not some guy sitting in a factory who understood how things worked. He had done some accounting for his college and did agricultural land management. He came from a family of landowners. And so essentially he was a man of his time. He was not some swashbuckling thinker. You have to understand that almost all the other free market thinkers of the time were aristocrats, mostly in France, who were trying to protect agriculture from the rise of commerce and industry. And therefore, what they proposed was freeing up agriculture by giving no taxes on agriculture. They wanted taxes on everything else. So this is actually where the origins of free market thought comes from. Smith's idea or the myth of Smith is so important that he is portrayed in the United States as essentially the founder of capitalism. This is a book, Greg Mankiw's economics tech book, has sold more than 1 million copies and netted him $42 million. And in it, he says that essentially all economics could be boiled down to the idea of essentially the invisible hand, that people buy stuff with desire or greed, and that runs the market. He even goes so far as to have a page in the textbook that says Adam Smith would have loved Uber. And I'm going to tell you today that Adam Smith not only didn't believe in this greed system that he's talking about, but he also wouldn't have liked Uber. Now, there's a reason that people think Adam Smith is sort of the father of this simplistic form of capitalism. And I want you to understand Mankiw's idea. He believes that all capitalist growth will simply come from greed, desire, so demand and supply. Let me ask you this. Do you think you could go into a partially developed economy and just free up demand and supply, and you would build a modern economy that way? Did anyone in China think that? Did anyone actually in this city really think that? Is that how this economy's worked? Did anyone in America think that? If you went today to, let's say, a country without a complex market and just said, let's have no government, let's let supply and demand happen. What kind of, and let's just free all trade completely. What kind of economy do you think you would get in, I don't know, Indonesia? What would happen? I mean, by the way, that's partially happening in Indonesia. It's actually just being cleared out by people in Singapore. I mean, I know some of the people deforesting Indonesia. But so Smith has these quotes that have made him seem like the poster boy for this idea that no government, basically supply and demand, and that's it. You're going to have wealth. It'll create untold wealth. And this is a kind of old utopian idea that just this kind of freeing up of nature will just create wealth. And so Smith has this famous idea that basically it's out of the greed of the brewer, the baker, and the butcher that the economy will run. And there's a passage which sounds like this, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which is not part of his intention. Smith understood, and this is actually, he's not the first to say this, so it's not like revolutionary, but Smith was aware of the fact that, yes, greed and desire play a big role in the market. They do. They absolutely do. And so by pursuing his own interests, he frequently promotes that of a society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So by just being greedy, he helps the society. Smith does definitely think that, okay? And there are lots of passages that suggest Smith is a modern neoliberal. And there are a whole bunch of just quotes here against taxes, against regulations, against personal choice. So if you just cherry pick these quotes, and these are the ones that neoliberals quote, you're like, yeah, Smith is definitely a precursor of modern neoliberalism. Great, okay? And he also has, this is a very important line in the book, where Smith says that self-interest can serve the public interest in a certain way. So if you take the quotes I showed you, remember this book is 1,200 pages long. And so if you take, I would say the 8 quotes that I've given you out of the 1,200 pages, it very much looks like Smith believes this. But that means you have to ignore the rest of the book, which often happens. Smith does not actually like the greed of merchants. He accepts it as a necessary evil. In fact, Smith doesn't like merchants at all. He doesn't like industrialists. And this is a tough sell for modern capitalism. And I'm going to just show you how much he thinks of that. He says the policy of monopoly is a policy of shopkeepers, the very people we were just talking about, the brewer, the butcher, right? And essentially, these shopkeepers, as he's going to say, they will always look for monopoly. They have no interest in the public good. So while they are necessary to an economy, and while they can drive an economy, their greed is not necessarily a good thing. In fact, what does he say of merchants? He says they're an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same as that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even oppress the public, and who accordingly have on many occasions both deceived and oppressed it. Wait a minute. Hold on. Where's our capitalist here? This is in The Wealth of Nations. Okay? That's quite a quote, isn't it? Merchants are an order of men whose interest is never exactly that of the public. They oppress the public. Gosh, who does he sound like there? I mean, he says that they care about business more than society. And he actually says they are inferior to the country gentleman. Whoa, wait a minute. That's not very capitalistic. So that merchants are only interested in their own thing. They're not interested in a better society, but country gentlemen are. By the way, is this your idea of capitalism? Is this how capitalism works? I'm just curious. He calls the class of artificers, manufacturers, and merchants, and he's talking about other people. He calls them an unproductive class. And what he says, look at this quote: artificers, manufacturers, and merchants can augment the revenue of the wealth of their society by parsimony only. This is really important, you guys. Mark Blythe wrote a chapter about this. This means by saving their money. This actually means that if businessmen and industrialists actually invest their money, they will not help the society. So the only thing they can do is make money and just save it. That might not make any sense to you. It makes sense to me because I understand the society in the 18th century, but it does not make sense for modern capitalism, right? You're not supposed to, if you are an industrialist, you're not supposed to just hoard your capital, are you? You're supposed to reinvest it. He says, don't do that. That's a bad thing. Have you ever seen these quotes, you guys? And they're in the book. I've been attacked for making up quotes, whatever. No, I'm not making up the quotes, you guys. They're just in the book. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry to all those who've criticized me. Oh, whoa, hold on. This is my favorite quote of all. No equal capital puts into motion a greater quantity of productive labor than that of the farmer. What? No equal quantity of productive labor employed in manufactures can ever occasion so great a reproduction. In them, nature does nothing, man does all. And the reproduction must always be in proportion to the strength of the agents that occasion it. In other words, since nature does not help businessmen and manufacturers, they're not very productive. Sit with me here and look at this quote and share perhaps my confusion. The capital employed in agriculture, therefore, not only puts into motion a greater quantity of productive labor than any equal capital employed in manufacturers. Is that modern capitalism? I want to know. Anybody here? So the productive forces of manufacturing can never produce as much as farming. Somebody, what do you think about that? Would that policy work? Anybody? Are you surprised? You can just nod yes or no. Are you surprised that Adam Smith says this? Would you be surprised to hear this in an economics class today? Who here thinks that farming is the source of wealth? So that if you're in Hong Kong, so the big Hong Kong money is all farmers? Right, yeah. Right, are they rich countries? That's right. What? Well, then you disagree with Adam Smith, my friend. Better be careful or you're going to end up like me, attacked every day, okay? Hold on, let me just move this thing. How can I move that? That's covering up one of my quotes there.
Yeah, try to get rid of this.
This is another one. This is one of my favorite quotes down here. Of all the ways in which a capital can be employed, farming is by far the most advantageous to the society. So if you had capital today, and I said, what are you going to put your investment in? Well, if you said Bitcoin, I'd say maybe you should invest in farming. Okay, invest in Indonesian deforestation. You'll make a better profit. But that's not farming, is it? That's defarming. Okay. So if I told you just invest in farming right now, people say, what are you bullish on? Where should I invest my money? I'm like, farming. What would you think? You're going to make a fortune in potatoes. But he's not growing any potatoes. We don't know exactly why he has that land, all right? He's a smart guy. There might be shortages later, but he's not working as a farmer. He's not overseeing any mass industrial farming there. You can make money from industrial farming, but he doesn't say industrial farming. And by the way, that's clear. He does not like the farming that he talks about is an antique form of virtuous farming where you're close to the land. Bill Gates is not close to the land. He doesn't look like he's a little Hong Kong. He likes a Porsche. He's got problems with younger women in the office. You know what I mean? The guy's not a virtuous farmer. Okay. I'm sorry. Uh-oh, this thing is gone again. So here's another quote, because I'm sorry, we're just going over these quotes. This is almost like a religious class in which we're going over the Bible together, because Smith is read like a biblical figure. He just happens to be completely misread, and that happens in religion. It's not supposed to happen in history. It's not supposed to happen in intellectual history, but it happens in economics. Why? Maybe because economics, as Cunningham said, and as you have quoted, works a little bit more like a religion than a science, okay? And that's why, for example, my friends who are big businessmen, they never pay attention to any ideology, except for that of good accounting. That's the one thing they're like, that's an ideology I believe in. But many of actually my business friends, they like authoritarianism. They like whatever works to make them a profit quickly. And they have no other ideology. I mean, the guys I know in America, they don't like democracy. That's not clear they like anything except hoarding money. They don't even invest their money. They hoard it where it cannot be taxed. The industry of merchants, artificers, and manufacturers, though in its own nature altogether unproductive, contributes indirectly to the increase of the produce of the land. So he says that the only way manufacturing and business help an economy is by actually helping farmers be more productive. That's actually simply strange, because at the time, from the Middle Ages in Italy, people knew that wasn't true in Europe. From the 16th century in Holland, people knew that industry made money on its own and farming didn't. Did you know in the 16th century, Holland actually stops using agriculture for food? It imports its food and it uses its farming for industrial goods. Okay, so this is some backward stuff, you guys. The labor of artificers and manufacturers adds nothing to the value of the annual produce, the value of the whole annual amount of the rude produce of the land, i.e., they actually bring no added value to an economic system. And so on and so forth, you guys. There are passage after passage after passage. So look at this one. So basically what happens is the unproductive class, that's businessmen and manufacturers, help farmers by delivering them from many cares which would otherwise distract their attention from the cultivation of the land. Can you imagine if all the capitalists in Hong Kong just worked to help farmers? What a weird city it would be. Sorry, I'm just telling you, Hong Kong is one of the great centers of world capitalism, at least one of the most interesting. And everything I'm showing you is laughably absurd, okay? Brought to you, well, I hate to say this, not necessarily by Scottish people, but your friends, the British, Okay. Sorry, I couldn't help it, man. So there's just quote after quote like this, and you have to ask yourself, what is this thing? Now, Smith then actually has someone who he obsesses about. He only writes about one person in the book economically. It's this French guy named Jean-Baptiste Colbert. And I gave a talk about him here on Monday. I happen to be the world specialist, one of the 3 world specialists on Colbert. I spent more than 15 years in his archives. I know them really well. Colbert believed in liberty of commerce, but he said, unless the state builds a market, more or less, you're not going to have liberty of commerce. That means trade treaties, roads, weights and measures, boats, ports, industrial standards. Otherwise, it won't work. But he says liberty of commerce is ideal, but you have to do some work first. Smith, who had never actually done any of this work, says that Colbert ran a mercantile government, and one of the worst things that he did was the preference given by the institutions of Colbert to the industries of towns above that of the country. I think, you guys, who does that remind you of? Well, I hate to say this, but when they start sending your young, brightest students to work into the fields, you need to get worried, especially in this part of the world. You know what I'm talking about? That's like when people's glasses start getting broken, okay? So Colbert is bad because he prefers industry over farming. There's your quote. You'll not hear in The Economist magazine. Twice a year, at least until recently, The Economist magazine would insult someone they thought was an imbecile economically by calling them Colbert. All right? Because Smith didn't like Colbert. Because Colbert favored industry over farming. I'm confused now. Now, Smith believed that wealth came from a modernization of farming. What did modernization of farming mean in Scotland in the 18th century? It meant land clearances. That actually was what we think is one of the first kind of proto-genocides, where they actually just start killing Scottish crofters. And what they would do is they would put them on boats to Canada, and sometimes, or they would put them on boats and just sink the boats. They figured out, and Smith talks a lot about how cows are the most productive agents in an economy. Cows are the most productive agents in an economy. Get Smith's book and word search the word cow. I'm just telling you, it's the 18th century. The 18th century is different from us. It's weird because it's a different time, all right? Smith was very much someone who supported these land clearances of replacing non-productive farmers with productive cattle. And that meant killing off a lot of people and creating the country of Canada, okay? Which actually might have been like the one useful thing that came out of this. I have a whole bunch of Smith quotes about how terrible the Highland people are. This was actually in Scotland, because if you put up these quotes in Scotland, Scottish people get really angry. They don't love Adam Smith in Scotland. I gave the inaugural lecture for the 300th anniversary of Smith's birth at the Adam Smith Foundation in his hometown. No one had any problems with what I said there. In fact, the chair of Adam Smith history at the University of Glasgow was like, yeah, we want to publish the talk. There wasn't any problem. But in America, it's a big problem. Okay, it's really interesting. By the way, let's figure out, why would Smith? I'm really interested here. Now, at least I hope that I've confused you a little bit on the idea of Adam Smith being the father of modern capitalism, and that Greg Mankiw uses him as the historical anchor of the most successful economic textbook in the United States. It means that Mankiw has not read Smith, or has read him and has understood nothing. And this, my friends, is the most influential teacher of free market thought in the United States. I'm trying to stay polite. Okay? So why would Smith say that farmers are more productive than businessmen and manufacturers? Do note that at this very moment, the birth of modern manufacturing was happening under Smith's nose. Have you guys ever heard of James Watt? He invented the first productive steam engine to be used for a motor used in textile manufacturing, okay? Textile manufacturing. You can still make money in textiles, you guys. Maybe not so much farming, but textiles. Now that one was a good one, okay? Smith found an office for James Watt in Glasgow. James Watt, by the time Smith dies, there are numerous factories operating in Britain. That is the first industrial revolution. It has begun. Smith knows it. He never mentions it because it's very worrisome to Smith. Can you imagine writing a book about economics at the moment, the 20 years that you get the birth of modern manufacturing, and never mentioning it once in the book? It would be like writing a book of economic thought today in San Francisco and never mentioning programming, never mentioning operating systems, never mentioning tech. That's Adam Smith, you guys. That is Adam Smith. Go look at his book. See what he says about industry at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and tell me he's the father of capitalism. You guys, I'm as surprised as you are. This sounds crazy. And why? Well, you know, Smith comes from a family of landowners. He's from a poorer branch, but nonetheless, they own land and they have their money from landowning. And that makes Smith part of a class. And I hate to bring up Karl Marx here, but yeah, Smith has class consciousness, my friends, very much so. Who are Smith's people? Oops. Here is Smith's ward. He is the teacher of the Duke of Buccleuch. This is like the richest guy in Scotland. He's one of the 4 richest men in Scotland. He owns all the land. Smith is his teacher. He travels with him to France. He lives in his country house. He helps them with land management. He eats at the dinner table. And do you know what he gets in return? Money. And he gets something even more remarkable for the founder of modern capitalism. He gets a job as a customs tax collector, which Smith gives up his academic career for. It's a pretty good deal. I mean, I'm getting older. Academia is hard. I'm being attacked by all these American neoliberals. If someone said, look, we're going to give you $750,000 US per year just to do some tax collection, I probably would consider it. I love being an academic. I have class consciousness. I'm a 6th generation academic, but I'm tired. And, you know, just collecting the money with my feet on the table, actually, maybe I would hate myself. Maybe not, you know. Smith didn't. Smith gave up the work for the money. So if I were Adam Smith, I'd give up academia, which he did. People wrote him about it. He denied he was doing it. Oh, my God. These professors. Oh, this was another guy he worked for. These are really, really like capitalist figures here. You guys, the father of modern capitalism. There were his friends. Prime Minister under George III. This period in Scotland was called the Age of Oligarchy. It meant that the country was run by a landed oligarchy, quite brutally, in fact. And by some coincidence, the oligarchy was actually dominated by the Scottish aristocracy. All of them were Smith patrons and friends. He taught their children. He lived in their houses. Oh boy, another one. Okay. Gosh, these guys look like they're founding Hong Kong. I mean, except those might have been the proto-capitalists. Smith wasn't with them. Okay. Smith was on the landed estate counting cows. All right. I'm sorry. Oh, another one. It just goes on and on. It looks like a private gentleman's club, and it is. And by the way, they're the ones who write internally to each other, we are going to help Adam Smith's career. Why would these guys help the founder of modern capitalism? I want to know. Can anybody tell me? Do these guys look like capitalists to you? Smith's thought is supporting them, and they're anti-capitalistic. Well, they're capitalistic in the sense they want their estates to be more productive. And Smith says, yes, modern farms are going to make money, not industry. Do you think these people like industry? No, they like farming. They are an agrarian oligarchy. They like Smith because he is not the father of modern capitalism. That's why Smith is with them. I just feel so bad for doing this because, well, that's my job, you guys. I'm a professor of history and philosophy. My job is to break up myths. And the fact is this one's not that hard to do. So what does all this have to do with greed? Well, I can tell you this. This project didn't help my greed because these guys have come after me and they've hurt my publishing. So to speak out against Adam Smith has hurt my bottom line. Smith does not like greed. Do you think hereditary landowners like to be called greedy? If you're an aristocrat, is that an aristocratic value, greed? I mean, if you start talking like this and walking around your great estate, if someone called you greedy, would you say, oh, thank you very much? No. Greed is not an aristocratic value, right? Greed is not a virtue. Smith is a professor of moral philosophy. Greed is in Christianity, and Smith is actually not a Christian, but within the framework of the time, there's a word for greed. It's called a sin. It's a sin. It's also bad philosophy because Stoic aristocrats like Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca do not believe in greed. In fact, the very essence of Stoicism is against greed. And by the way, I highly recommend reading the Stoics. I love them. I think it's phenomenal philosophy. This order of things is favored by the natural preference of man for agriculture, the order that we're in. The capital of the landlord, on the contrary, which is fixed in the improvement of his land, seems to be as well secured as the nature of human affairs can admit it, i.e., the order of things which we must protect is agriculture, and that all money goes back into agriculture. Mercantile stock only continues the existence of its own value without producing any new value. That's crazy. Its profits are only the repayments of the maintenance which its employer advances to himself during the time that he employs. The labor of the artificers and manufacturers never adds anything, I've said this before, to the value of the whole annual amount of the rude produce of the land. I am hammering this, okay? I want to just jump forwards. Greed or avarice, he says, is a vice, and he equates it with monopoly. And his main idea in his work is to understand virtue and economy. Therefore, greed can never be a part of this. Therefore, business can never be the primary driver of a virtuous economy. It just cannot. The very point of the Wealth of Nations is an attempt to recognize that greed has a very important part to play in this new economy. However, it must be dominated by another system and another class. He was horrified by the idea that greed could be a virtue, and he called it sophistry, okay? The idea that private vices, that means greed, is a public benefit. That's one of the most famous lines in free market thought. Private vices are public benefits. Smith says, no, that's impossible. Vice cannot be a virtue. Because the love of virtue is the noblest and the best passion of human nature. The love of virtue, my friends, not the love of money, not the love of monopoly, but the love of virtue, which is a gentleman farming the land.
And that's because the gentleman who farms the land is a repository of wisdom and virtue, prudence, justice, fortitude, and moderation of the mind. Civil government means subordination. Someone has to run government and run it with virtue, or you will have a society that doesn't work. And so the man whose public spirit is prompted altogether by humanity and benevolence will respect the established powers and privileges, even of individuals, and still more those of the great orders in society into which the state is divided. In other words, the people that have to run the country are those who will preserve the social order. This is not the revolution of capitalism. This is not democracy, my friends. This is not a society based on merit. It is these guys. And you finally got rid of them. I know some people are sad about it, but if you look at the state of Britain, I think definitely dodged a bullet in getting rid of the British. These are the established order. This is it. This is what when Smith says established order, you guys, it is not some vague idea. Established order is like a really strong word, isn't it? Established order. Think about where you live now. You can't really go against the established order, can you? You couldn't back then. All right. The great historians of Smith in the 18th century said Smith was protecting this age of oligarchy. So I'm not the first to say this. Anyone who knows Scottish history knows this is the truth. And this is by a guy named Donald Winch, who is the greatest historian of all this. He wrote about this in the 70s. So basically, Smith talks about a natural aristocracy, which is an old idea. And he talks not about greed, not about businessmen, not about entrepreneurs, but about the man whose public spirit is prompted altogether by humanity and benevolence, and will respect the established powers and privileges, even of individuals, and still more those of the great orders in society into which the state is divided. I'm repeating that. It is a reactionary concept. Now, you might believe that too. That's fine. But this is not modern capitalism. It is the preservation of the natural order of an agrarian aristocracy. And he says it in his books. So why is this important? Well, the first thing is that I'm just going to say this outrightly. If the economists who have told you that Adam Smith is the father of modern capitalism, if that's what they've told you, I would be very, very careful in listening to anything else they say. I would also be trying to figure out who on earth the fathers of modern capitalism are, because it sure ain't Adam Smith. Now, in my book, I try and explain this. And this is very upsetting for lots of Americans, very painful to hear that their secular myth is not what it's supposed to be. Therefore, it can only be wrong and I can only be dishonest. That is the reason that we've been getting dishonest, incompetent. The texts are here. You can look at the quotes yourself. And if you think I'm dishonest and incompetent, you can politely write me and tell me. But first, you need to actually read the book yourself, look at the quotes, and tell me what you actually think. Now, I teach a course, you guys, in which we read all of these books. And at the end of the semester, the students read Adam Smith. And when they read Adam Smith in his entirety, a couple of them will come up with the standard thing. I think that's because they never read the book. The two students that gave me that, I don't think they were that involved with, I don't think they were that involved with doing the work. The other 28 students actually gave readings so complex that I've actually recently used them in my own work. They were so good. I was like, wow. I mean, Smith has so much in it and the book is so confusing. It's extremely helpful having young people whose eyes work and whose brains are functioning to actually read the book. It's extremely painful to ask them to do it, though, because it's 1,200 pages. They also have to read The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and we read a lot of other big books. So it's hard work to do it, the kind of work that economists don't do. Economists write 7-page articles. So what I'm telling you here is not only, I would say, I'm not necessarily, I mean, what am I doing? I'm rereading a book from the 18th century that's been misinterpreted into this time. I think that's what I'm trying to show you, is that the fact that I'm one of the people doing this is absolutely insane. That here in 2023, we're finally getting historically accurate readings of Adam Smith, and that there's deep resistance to it. That is crazy as far as I'm concerned. And yet that seems to be the job that I've undertaken, and has been very strange and often unpleasant, because when people constantly write that you're dishonest and it goes on the web, people start believing it. And unless they actually go back and look at the book, they won't necessarily know. That's why I gave you a speech today, a talk with all the quotes on the board, so that if you didn't believe me, you could take a picture, you could go find the quote yourself, just word search it, all right? And so that's kind of, I've left you with this kind of odd situation. We're in a moment where free market thought doesn't really seem that relevant. Most of us recognize that the state plays a big role. We can certainly recognize that low taxes can sometimes be effective, that regulation can be too heavy. But the idea of developing an economy and building a market without a rather active state is something that in Asia people will laugh about. Let's just take an example before I stop. Do you think that South Korea is a successful capitalist country? Why not? You think South Korea has a high crime rate? Okay. But do you think that it's successful in capitalism? Okay. That's what many of my Korean students will say to me. Yeah, absolutely. But they say if we don't work for one of the three chaebol, we will not have a good life. By the way, the chaebol are spending a lot of money promoting an ideology. Do you know what it is? Free market thought. They're spending a lot of money on it. The president of South Korea right now is Mr. Free Market. He represents the chaebol. Oh, it reminds me of Adam Smith. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think that South Korea has successful products? Does anyone own a South Korean product? Who has a Samsung telephone? Who has a South Korean automobile? Maybe not here in where you're close to China, but in the United States, they're everywhere. Is there any European country that builds a smartphone that's successful? No, not even. Is there any computer from Europe? Computer brand? Are you buying the Le Forêt computer? The great French computers that everyone loves? No, you're buying South Korean computers, cars, and cell phones. They have succeeded at some kind of industrial capitalism. How did they do it? They had an authoritarian government. And guess what? Those companies were protected by the state, the chaebols. They were what Koreans called hothouse flowers. Well, that's a problem for free market thought, and not something that the president of Korea wants to discuss. Now, Korea has a remarkably free press, so almost every day there's an article attacking the chaebol in the Korean press. It's actually kind of amazing, I will tell you that. You're like, whoa, you're attacking your most successful companies day in and day out. My assumption is that could be helpful if it makes a difference. But the point is that the history of Asian wealth, which is the modern history of wealth creation, does not sound like Adam Smith. It sounds like it's not about farming, and it's not just about trading back and forth. It's about a very complex set of elements. So, I mean, I guess we're just sort of stuck with the question, why are these Americans so obsessed with free market thought? Why would they attack a little professor like me? Why are we even sitting around talking about it? And I think these are important questions. And so I want to leave you guys live in a very interesting part of the world. You've got your problems, but also your advantages. You do live in Hong Kong, which is pretty nice, but I read the wealth inequality numbers today. Boy, they're even worse than the United States. I didn't think that was possible. I really didn't. So that's problematic, but you also have many economic successes here, which are quite extraordinary. How does it all work? And what ideology defines the success of Hong Kong, the challenges of Hong Kong, the successes of China, the successes of South Korea? How do we even begin to talk about Japan, which never makes any sense, but somehow is always there? It's still there, producing things that people want, that I want, okay? What ideology economically should we be using? Is there one out there that even fits any of this? The one response I can give you is, unless you are an agrarian land magnate and an aristocrat, Adam Smith's not your guy for capitalism. Thank you.
So feel free to ask any questions you might have. I just wanted to take moderator's privilege here and ask the first question. I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about Alexander Hamilton and how he may or may not, in your opinion, provide a better guide to successful capitalist development versus.
So in the 18th century, at this very moment, as America is trying to win its independence from the British, Adam Smith's book arrives. People have read it, and a lot of them are landowners and slaveholders, okay? And a lot of them really like this idea because slaveholders are essentially, slavery is like serfdom. It's just one step from serfdom. You're just basically like a late feudal, actually, slavery comes before serfdom and after. It's always around slavery. So some of the landowners in America like it, but Hamilton writes an entire book more or less contradicting Smith, Project on Manufacturers. And he says, if we were to try and build a country on agriculture, we would fail and be poor. That's the worst possible idea. Because contrary to what Smith says, machines produce a lot more than agricultural labor. He said, not only that, this is what the British want, and the French want it too, because they've got these advanced proto-industrial economies, and America has nothing. America didn't even have money at that point. In fact, Thomas Jefferson used to ride into Philadelphia onto Market Street and 6th to buy his Portuguese wines, to buy his English watches, to buy his French canes and clothing. They didn't make anything in America. We still don't make anything in America, sorry. That's kind of, we've done pretty well by not making so much recently, but that's another story. What Hamilton said is that if we do not have some protectionism and some subsidies, really small ones, 10% here, 2% there, super design, that's called an industrial strategy. And if we don't close our borders, we will just be destroyed. They will destroy us. So they do it. It's a long fight. I actually just wrote an article about this. I wrote an article. I've also written an academic article about this. It's a long battle within America, but he actually ends up convincing Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who were landowners and support Smith. After 20 years, they're like, you know what? We really actually need this protectionism, and we need industry. Without industry, we can't have an army. And without an army, the French and the British will just take it all away from us again, which is absolutely true. Hey, the Spanish could even do it too and try, right? And so the country develops with tariffs, controlled markets, and subsidies, and becomes quite a rich country in the end. The Americans do not free their markets until the 1930s. When is the first real free market reform in the United States? Yeah, no, I think it was the 30s the first time like they tried it. Anyway, I'm just saying, all you have to do is look at the history. So it's pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting that America has declared itself a free market country. Britain declared itself a free market country during the 19th century. Where did British wealth come from in the 19th century? Anybody know? It's rich really rich, although they don't have a lot to show for it. Not a lot of infrastructure or buildings. Doesn't look like Paris to me. They've got industry, the Industrial Revolution, and they got colonies, you guys. Are colonies free trade? How do colonies work? Peter, on the first day, took me to the big police station in downtown Hong Kong, the British police station. What do you think of that building? Is that a free market building? That's one of the biggest pre-20th century oppressive complexes I've ever seen in my life. It looks like a maximum security prison in Arizona. It's huge. It's gigantic. It's fortified everywhere. That's part of the free market system. Free market Britain in the 19th century is colonial Britain. So there might be free markets, some of it, but a huge amount of the wealth that's going into that free industry is coming from gunboats. And that takes us back to Hong Kong. What? Robbery. Colonialism, the same word. Robbery, but also, I mean, torture. That building really shocked me. I just never knew. I will never look at Hong Kong the same again. And I actually have not been thinking about colonialism in the right way. That building, everyone should go visit it to think about what colonialism meant. There were a lot of people in Hong Kong who were clearly violently fighting against the British because the British were probably doing something to them that they didn't like. Or else, why would they need such a big prison? Very interesting. No, I'm not saying that this has happened. Let's take the Singaporean view. What's happened. Let's make the best of it. But it's still very important when we start thinking of a country that called itself free market nation in the 19th century. A friend of mine wrote a book called Free Market Nation without discussing colonialism. By the way, he was never attacked. It's a good book in a lot of ways. He's a really good historian. But it's a little bit of an oversight. Just so you know, I grew up in France, even though my family's partially English. When you go to school in France, we're not taught good things about the English people. I'm not sitting here criticizing French colonialism, am I? But the fact is one of the reasons that I don't have any, let's say, myths about Britain is because I do have a French education, which can be very helpful, at least in understanding differences and realities about things. Thoughts, questions, you guys. What do you think? Does this seem at all useful, what I've told you? Yes. Well, there are lots. I would really say, first of all, the medieval Italians create banking and multi-partner firms and accounting. So it all starts really in Tuscany, not even Venice, Tuscany, okay? I make a big argument about it's Tuscany. And that's quite something, what they're able to do. Has to do with the arrival of Arabic numerals coming in the 1200s, the invention of accrual double entry accounting, which China did not invent, I'm sorry. I'm an expert in the history of accounting. China gets close, but there's no one doing assets and liabilities, balancing them out. And that's just it. If you don't have liabilities on your account books, you're not doing double entry. And the early Chinese accounting doesn't have it. I've looked, I've asked, it's not there. Doesn't mean that China wasn't rich, doesn't mean it wasn't successful. But this modern capitalism is why the Europeans colonized the rest of the world. After that, it's the Dutch. And the Dutch create something called the Dutch East India Company. Until recently, it was held up as a model of free markets. By the way, what was the Dutch East India Company's main sources of revenue? Does anybody know? What? Well, sure. Well, yeah. Sure. But the biggest load of money coming was also slavery. That's helpful too, right? But there's one other little point. A guy named Alexander Bick, PhD student at Princeton, went into the archives and found a whole bunch of memos that no one had published showing that the government had been running the company the whole time. I had actually found that in the history of accounting, that the government had actually moved in and done a giant audit and help the company when there was insider trading in 1622. So wait a minute, the first publicly traded firm, the first giant mega state company also has state management. Oops. You'll find that in my book. And you can go and check the footnotes yourself. Some of them might be a little garbled, but just follow them with a little good faith, and they will take you to sources that will show you this, primary sources. Is that a hand? Or is that you're touching your glasses? Careful. Is that a hand? Or is that a scratch? You scratching? Thoughts? Yes. I don't know, but I do know it's going to be a partnership. That the state will never completely go away. So what you need are smart people, you need reformers, you need civil society, you need really intelligent business people. For example, in accounting, if you let the state write accounting standards, it'll be a disaster. Industry has to help them do it. The same goes for finance. So it's very complicated, because then if the finance people get into writing the regulations, they cheat. It's a very hard balance between the state and private industry. But in many cases, the state and private industry are like this. There's a word for that. I call it Singapore. Okay. So it's pretty strong. It just depends how well you do it. Sometimes less is better, but in certain instances, more is better too. It depends where you are. And it depends on your security needs. If you have a country that can't produce a microchip and you are a massive military power, well, you might want to start producing some microchips. It's not that easy to do. So the question of that is, it depends, but there will never be no state unless you want to be in South Sudan, okay? And by the way, I wonder if the no tax policy is the best policy in Hong Kong. Just be interesting to hear that discussion, because for all of Hong Kong's successes, having 34% of the population making 2,400 or 2,700 Hong Kong dollars per month does not seem like a successful situation to me. It makes no sense when you have like one of the richest cities in the world. It's a little crazy, all right? And I wonder, taxes are weird. I live in California. We have the highest taxes in the world. We also have the highest GDP per capita of any large entity on earth, $79,000 a year. That's our GDP per capita. We have no natural resources. We have no infrastructure. We have the highest taxes, and they suck. Excuse me, I have to pay them, and it's a nightmare. So much money. But we do have one thing, you guys. We have probably the most funded higher education research system on earth right now. Much better than Britain's. No one compares to ours as a full system. It's quite extraordinary. And guess what? All those companies in Texas came from ideas that were created by people with brains that come from California. Sorry, I interrupted somebody. Thoughts, questions? I'm a capitalist, you guys. I am a capitalist. I just don't want to be a fantasy capitalist. Yes. Right. Yeah. But isn't that a hard one, right? So will Biden's program for semiconductors work? Maybe over time it's going to be hard. That's actually how it works. That's one of the things we see. I've studied the wool industry in the 17th and 18th centuries in France. And what the conclusion of that, I think, is the conclusion you often get. It was moderately successful. But what it did do, so they didn't beat the British, but it set the stage so that they could compete with them forever. And by the way, if you're buying clothing today, it probably is not owned by a British firm. It's probably owned by a French firm. So it is often necessary, but doesn't mean it's going to work. But if you don't do it, you might have some problems. I mean, does America really want to have no solar industry? That seems insane, right? And hopefully there will not be more tensions between China and America. That's a bad thing for everybody. And I wish that we were just not in this situation because it's depressing. Okay, it's just depressing. Considering the economies are like this. Where I teach in my university, all of our students, like not all of them, so many people come from China. It just seems very odd that we're fighting when we're working together all the time. Okay. But I think that's just a hard question. But the fact is that if you don't do it, then what happens? Is the market smart enough to facilitate and produce key industries for the military, for example? Do capitalists actually care about national security? Not the ones I know about. What do they care about? They care about, this is what they care about. And that's it. And so if the Chinese are going to be making American security technology for less money and they're going to make profits, fine. Do you think China would let Americans make their security equipment? It's so stupid that no. So the market doesn't do lots of things. Just doesn't. By the way, my dad's a vaccine researcher. He trained lots and lots and lots of, trained 110 Chinese vaccine experts. He said that all the vaccine stuff at the top vaccines in the United States, none of that was funded by private industry. All of it came from the state. He said, because private industry does not want these long-term things. Because America had such high funding for its biology, non-applied biology, we were able to do those vaccines, which he said were a quantum leap and a semi-miracle. He said, but he'd been working on them since 1979 or something. So I'm just telling you, like, when my father looks at these things, he's like, no private money came near this. There were no profits to be made. You need actually a visionary research sector, which is not capitalistic. The capitalists have to then work with that.